Will is a caretaker at MIT. While sweeping the floor this day, he was fascinated by the maths problems in the hallway. In no time at all, he had the correct answer written out. The next day, the professor of mathematics saw the answer on the blackboard. The maths problem he'd been working on for 3 months and hadn't come up with an answer. Someone had just worked it out. He had a look of disbelief on his face. He went back to the classroom and asked who had done it. None of the students admitted it. So the professor put another maths problem on the blackboard in the hallway that was almost a world problem. The next day, Will saw the new problem. It was difficult. It took him a couple of minutes to work out the correct answer. At that moment, the professor came out of class. He saw Will, the caretaker, fiddling with chalk. The professor thought Will was going to scribble. The professor scolds Will as he walks away. Will walked away disdainfully when the professor came back to check the maths problem on the board. The correct answer was already written on the board. The professor was amazed. Because of this problem, that the professor hadn't been able to work out for years, the caretaker had solved it in 10 minutes. When the professor tried to find the caretaker, he couldn't find him. It turned out that Will had been expelled for fighting, and was sued in court by his parents. In the courtroom, Will used his knowledge of the law from school to argue his case. The judge couldn't even argue with him. It was an impressive argument, but it was only a mitigating factor. It doesn't get you out of jail. At this point, the professor found out about Will through the school health office. The professor said to Will, "I can get you out of here, but you have to promise me 2 things. Firstly, come with me and do some mathematical research. And 2, go into psychotherapy." It turns out that Will was abandoned by his parents when he was a child, so he doesn't have any love for the world. So, Will is actually lonely inside, low self-esteem, vulnerable. Will wanted to get out, so he agreed to the professor. And then, Will spent his days solving mathematical problems for the professor, and his value was truly evident. But what happened to Will next? The professor was left scratching his head. This young man is amazing. The psychiatrist helped him with his psychological problems. He ended up giving the psychiatrist a psychotic break. Let's see what the guy did. Because Will used to love reading psychology books, so he talked to the psychiatrist for a brief period of time, and then he deduced that the doctor was gay. He deduced that the doctor was a homosexual, and when Will guessed it, the doctor left in a huff. The professor had to call in a second psychiatrist. The result was the same, because Will guessed what was wrong with them every time. It was as if they had come to see Will. Then there were many more, but there was still nothing Will could do. Then the professor had to call in his best friend from college, Paul. He was an arrogant psychiatrist. He wouldn't take on any of the minor ailments, until the professor said the boy had been blacklisted by many psychiatrists. Then Paul agreed. When Will and Paul meet, they go head to head. Will saw a painting of a woman on the wall. He guessed that Paul must be lonely. Maybe Will's expression was ambiguous. It made Paul angry, but Will was right too. Paul's wife hadn't been dead long, and so the first meeting between the 2 men ends badly. That night Will fell in love with a girl at the bar. After getting to know her over time, the relationship grows. Will feels a warmth from his girlfriend that he has never felt before. After a good time, then a change happens. His girlfriend said she had gotten into graduate school at Stanford. She wants Will to go with her. Will was angry and refused, because Will's whole life is here. If he went there, he'd have trouble surviving. If that was the case, it would mean that they would have to be separated. Because Will had been abandoned by his parents as a child, Will was very sensitive to these things. The night was very painful for them both. Afterwards, his girlfriend went to Stanford anyway, and Will chose to go to the construction site. Professor didn't want to see Will go down like that, so he set up many interviews for him, but Will never gave it a second thought. When he became impatient, he asked a friend to impersonate him for an interview. More and more interviews were being held. Will was getting a little angry. He didn't like the mess his life was in. He didn't want to be a maths genius right now. He just wanted to follow his heart. The professor looked at the burnt-out solution. He was also in pain. Why would a good mathematical genius give himself up like this? If you can't have it, why would he let such a mathematical genius torment himself? The professor's heart was in tears. Will then went back to work on the site and continued to move bricks. At this point, Will's friend spoke up. He warned Will, "If you're still working on the site in 3 years, I will kill you, because you don't know how to appreciate it. You're like winning a $10 million lottery ticket, but you don't cash it in because you're weak and cowardly. What you have now is what I could never get if I tried. It's true that we usually have fun drinking and talking together, but every time I come to your house, I wish you'd gone away, because you don't belong here. You can go out and embrace a bigger world. I wish you could have a better life." Will was awakened by his friend's words. He seemed to understand something. Will found Paul. He saw Paul looking at some photos of abuse. Paul told him, "This is a picture of me being abused as a child." Paul also told him about the abuse he had suffered as a child. Seeing that Paul had been through the same thing as himself, Will seemed to understand Paul's feelings. Paul tried to get Will to open up. He told Will a lot of things he didn't want to reveal, but Will was a tough guy. He never admitted it. It was at that moment he couldn't contain his feelings anymore. He hugged Paul and cried. And then, Will devoted himself to mathematics. He was fascinated by mathematics. Slowly, he let go of everything something that had happened before. He went on to find a girlfriend. He also found himself in the growing success of his mathematical research. They say the greats are in the people. A caretaker can be a mathematical genius. Let the world see your light shine brightly.